You're listening to Japanese Baptist Church in Seattle, Washington.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of JBC Connect. I'm really excited to have two wonderful guests today. We have the Reverend Dr. Marcia Patton, and we have Nora Percival, who is here with us. And why I've invited them is because recently they released a new book called Sacred Decisions, Consensus in Faith Communities. And it's released through Judson Press. And I'm so happy for them. I'm so excited, but even more happy for the fact that they're covering this very important topic. I just felt this, the subject of this book is so relevant and important to today. So lots to talk about. But before we do that, I thought it'd be good for our listeners to learn more about you. So maybe Marcia and Nora, would you mind just taking a moment to just, briefly just let us know, who are you, for the sake of our conversation together?
Marcia Patton. I am the Executive Minister of Emerita of Evergreen Association of American Baptist Churches. That means I retired from that position, not from life. So I do all kinds of things, but it was being in that position that led in large part to this book. Nora?
Yes, hi. My name is Nora Percival. I am a Quaker, and Quakers have been using a form of consensus that we call seeking unity since the 1650s, since the beginning of this denomination. And so I come from a long tradition of not voting, to put it as simplistically as possible. And I was not raised a Quaker, but I became one as a young adult. I'm retired healthcare administrator, and currently I do a lot of things too, but I would say my most active interest is that I have a health education mission in Kenya, in East Africa, where I go and train health workers when COVID allows me to.
Wow, that's great. Two incredible individuals. I mean, both of you, just even saying that very casually, like there's so much behind that. I think we could spend hours on hours just exploring that. But I will show restraint. I would love to know more about how this book came together. Like, how did your past intersect that? So tell me a bit more about this history of this collaboration, because that's really interesting to me.
Well, it started with the Church Council of Greater Seattle asking me to lead a workshop on consensus for one of their all-day training events. That is, I had an hour and a half. Each workshop was about that long. And I always start workshops with asking people to introduce themselves, and in this case, what faith community they're from. We go around the circle and meet Nora, who says she's from University Friends meeting. And I want to say to her, why don't you just lead this workshop? I don't know a thing. But instead say something a little bit politer, like, please, help along the way, because you clearly know a whole lot about this. Mm-hmm. I'll let Nora take the story from there.
Thank you. Yes, I was a member of the board of directors of the Church Council at the time, and so was attending their annual all-day conference, Weaving Our Strengths. And I hadn't really thought ahead of time what I was going to do there. I just showed up because I was a director, and I looked through the workshops and I thought, oh, consensus, that should be interesting to get a non-Quaker perspective on it. So I dropped into Marcia's workshop, and as she mentioned, she very graciously invited me to essentially, co-host spontaneously. In any case, it was a very interesting workshop. And at the end of it, we talked to each other, and it seemed like, I don't know if this is really true, but my memory says that pretty much at the same time we said, let's do that together again. And so we did a few more. We found a few other venues to do a few workshops. And then how that turned into the book is actually Marcia's story, because it's relevant to the book she published earlier.
Oh.
Well, and I don't actually remember whatever conversation she's referring to, but at least at one point when we were kind of frustrated with not getting invitations to do workshops, I said, well, sometimes if you have a book about it, and I said, one of the things that I think people need is Robert's Rules of Order, the title of that book, for consensus. And I said, I wasn't able at the time that Evergreen was formed to find anything out there that was like that. And so we said, well, couldn't we do that? And I said, well, I have written a book, so there is a publisher that we can at least initially throw that idea to. And I think we were beginning to work on an outline when I happened to lead a workshop at the church where Judson Press's publisher went to church. So, and I mentioned in that workshop that churches should do work by consensus, and told her that we were kind of talking about it, and she said, send us a proposal. So
wow. So it was just kind of like, it just sort of all lined up very nicely, just step by step, I guess.
right. Yeah.
Marcia is correct. We had started working on the book among all our other activities. But then when Judson Press, at least it felt to me like when Judson Press said, yes, we want to see a proposal, we kind of got, okay, now we're going to really do this. And we got pretty disciplined about it. We met regularly. We worked on it every week in pieces. And it really helps to have a publisher.
Yeah. So it sounds like it was kind of just organically evolving. It was more like just filling a need, I guess. And then, because like, I don't think it sounds like you weren't thinking like, let's make a book, like let's present it. It was almost like, as we're making this, like, oh, I think we got a book. And then someone says, that sounds like a book, send us a proposal. It was just sort of like an organic evolution. And like, oh, here we are. We have a book now, I guess. Is that fair?
Well, I mean, we specifically worked on the book. It was our COVID project.
Right.
We met, like she said, about I think initially once a month, but that quickly wasn't enough. We met every 2 weeks. At one point when we were trying to get the first draft to the publishers by the deadline, I think we even met every week to make sure that things got out the door. So we met as often as need be. Fortunately, we live near each other. We didn't have to do everything by Zoom. We had lots of good meals together, but it was pretty intentional once we sent that proposal to Judson and got yeah, we're interested in this back from them.
Well, I'm so glad you did it. I totally agree with you that there's a real need for this kind of manual for like folks who don't know the Quaker tradition, who are coming from a different perspective. Right. Now that we've kind of heard a bit more of like the actual history of the book, I think it'd be really interesting for me to hear more about what is it that has put so much of your energy into this concept of consensus leadership from both of you. It's, the energy and like the commitment required to write a book of any sort, right? There's a whole story behind it. Like there needs to be a passion that ignites that. And so I'd love to hear about what is your personal investment or your personal journey with consensus?
Well, again, let me start. So my journey has to do with the Evergreen Association of American Baptist Churches. And I'm not assuming that all of your audience knows a lot about that. We're a region of American Baptist churches, and we're fairly unique for two reasons. One is that we're organized by ethnic caucuses. And secondly, we do our work by consensus. And it really is the combination of the two. The fact that we're organized by ethnic caucuses, our quorum requires a person to be present from every caucus, is at first unique. But if we had chosen to do our work the normal way, which in Baptist circles is usually using Robert's Rules of Order, I don't think that we would have been as successful as we've been. It was taking that extra step of determining that majority rule, which was really how it was put initially in the bylaws, was that majority rule will rule unless otherwise indicated in these bylaws. That's what gave the framers of Evergreen pause. In the original discussion about structure, they'd said nothing about that. But when you had to actually write bylaws, that was what was in the bylaws. A majority would rule, and everybody just stopped. And I think the thinking was, because nobody, I mean, they stopped. It was silent. That's not going to work. You know, because at that time we had 3 caucuses functioning, and that meant 2 caucuses could overthrow the third, and that just didn't seem right or fair or whatever. So we tentatively said, well, could consensus work? And we couldn't find a lot of work on it. I didn't know Nora at the time, but I did have a friend of hers and mine. And I asked him, I said, what can you tell me about consensus? He said, well, in the Quaker tradition, we call it the sense of the meeting. And I thought, I don't have a prayer of a chance of teaching Baptists what sense of the meeting is. I'd rather use consensus to get there, as hard as that may be. And anyway, reported back what I learned. Others did some research, and we agreed to at least give it a try. Mm-hmm. But like I said, Evergreen has been, and the Evergreen Way has been extraordinarily successful, but it's only been successful, I think, because that was part of it. It really equaled out the voices of our caucuses. We really could, because we quickly went to achieving consensus through, in our bigger meetings, through our caucuses. When we're in the executive committee meeting and there's only 10 people max or so, it's not a problem to just have conversation among us and reach consensus among us. But when you're talking even 30 people, it helps Evergreen to divide up into the caucuses. And then if a caucus doesn't understand or needs more information on a thing, you know, it helps get us to a better place than votes ever would have gotten us, and majority rule for sure ever would have gotten us. Nora, I know you just have a passion about believing what you believe as a Quaker, so please.
Yes, my story is very different, and I'm sitting here listening to Marcia and thinking about the miracle of how we have taken such different roads, started in such different places personally and professionally, and taken such different roads and come to stand side by side with the same passion and the same intention. It's really, it's even more proof of the power of faith-based consensus, which is, in truth, as I understand it, and Marcia and I think she agrees because we wrote this in the book, it's not actually consensus in the literal sense of getting everybody to agree. So the word consensus means rule by agreement. And some people think that means you have to get everybody in the room to say, yes, we all think the same thing. But that's not really what faith-based consensus is. It's actually a dictatorship of God. What we're doing collectively is discerning the will of God together. And God's driving the boat, you know. And so I'm passionate about this because it brings me closer to God. It informs my seeking to have a faith-based life. It allows me and everybody who uses it to give up on the essentially competitive winner and loser duality of majority rule. You know, when you have majority rule, except in the rare occasions when you have a unanimous vote, which is very rare, somebody loses. And I've always been uncomfortable with that. I've never wanted to play team sports as a kid. I would walk away on the playground from when we would team up to play casual games, because even if I was on the winning team, the other team lost. Somebody was losing. And I have a deep sense of the wrongness of living in a world where there has to be winners and losers. So it's one of the reasons I came to Quakers. I became a Quaker was because it's a community that has turned its back on the idea that there must be winners and losers, and has instead embraced a belief that we can together discern the will of God, and that will bring us not only closer to God, but closer to each other. So yes, I'm quite passionate about it. It informs everything in my life and has for decades.
Thank you, Nora. That's really wonderful and very articulate way of like kind of putting it, is that this isn't just about rule making, right? It's like actually like a spiritual lifestyle, right? It's like a philosophy and an approach, and it doesn't just relate to administration. It's about how we deal with relationship with each other, relationship with God. And, I think you just said it so wonderfully. I don't need to add more to what you said. Marcia, but for the people that, maybe are not familiar with Evergreen, so it sounds like then you discovered, you often use the word we, as I was listening to you, is that this is not like kind of like Marcia pushed consensus or something, but it was something that came together. But now the context for other people, they might not know this discussion that you've had with the people who formed Evergreen, and you were clearly a key part of it. This is what, about 20 years ago, is that right?
Yeah, about that, a little less.
Yeah, around 20 years ago. So you have a group of people saying like, okay, we're going to take this whole like major connection of Baptist churches, and we're just going to kind of throw out the rules of Robert's order, which is like almost has like a sacred standing, I think, amongst Baptists, right?
Absolutely. Robert was a Baptist.
Well, okay. Well, I did not know that. I'm learning something new in every podcast. And I'm a Canadian. So this consensus stuff sounds really interesting to me because I also, I'm coming from like a different context in that I'm used to like political parties not being like just two to choose from. And, like almost like a third one that just is just really a farce in a way, like, no one's really going to choose it because it doesn't do anything. We have multiple parties. We don't have a melting pot up there. We sort of have a mosaic, and like there's a lot more kind of language about inclusion and living with differences. So I have to admit, when I came to America about 20 years ago, I really felt that like you've got to choose this, you've got to choose that. There's a winner, there's a loser. And I'm just kind of setting this up because I'm thinking, okay, Marcia, like I remember distinctly when I came from Canada to the US, I was like, I'm feeling a very different paradigm here. All those kind of approaches that I had to about, can we have conversations or listen? Does there have to be like, if I'm this, I'm that? I felt often when I came to America, people were always asking me to choose an issue. And if I chose this stance on an issue, that means that I don't stand for this then. It was like, if you do this, you're not that, whatever it may be, politically, religiously. And what you're talking about 20 years ago at the same time when I came in sounds really, really different. So where I want to come with this is that as a Canadian coming to America, I began to think like, can we actually have consensus about anything? Like, is this something I just have to let go of? It just felt so countercultural. And then I can only imagine 20 years ago, you folks all huddled in this conference room talking about consensus. That was totally against the grain of what I thought I saw in the culture. So what I'm kind of curious about for myself and maybe for our viewers is, what do you feel are the major resistance points to consensus, given the American climate? And I would love to hear more, Marcia, even if you want to give me context, like what were the major pushbacks that you had at that time 20 years ago? But Nora, I'd also like to hear from you is, from your perspective as a Quaker, what is it that people are just so afraid of about consensus, or like they just don't want to take part in it?
There's a lot of rabbit holes that I could go down.
Yeah.
But to keep the focus on consensus, I know that initially one of the first things that gave the Euro Caucus a lot of hesitation about trying it is that they were afraid of the tyranny of the one. The one person who would continue to say no, no matter what. And, Yosh kept assuring them, our friend Yosh kept assuring them, no, that won't happen because that's not the way it's done. Well, I'm still not sure Yosh is any kind of expert in consensus. But it still helped to have that friend that tried to assure us. And I know, just my gut instinct said, and it was only gut at that point, was, well, it seems to me like if you do what we were calling consensus, well, you will surround that one. And if that one can feel heard enough that their concerns are in the answer, whatever answer you come up with, then they won't block it. Because I think, especially in churches where we take votes, there is the one that will vote no just because they think that somebody should vote no, not because they have any real concern, but they just don't want this unanimous thing on the thing. And I would contend that if they're really against something, then they do need to be able to, the group needs to help them articulate it so that a better response might be found. Nora, what's your take on this?
I think the biggest resistance to consensus is ignorance, which is to say lack of understanding, not stupidity, but just being uneducated about what it actually is.
I think that's true.
And often people will come into my Quaker community and struggle with it. And often they refer to previous experiences of consensus done badly. College food co-op meetings that went on for 7 hours because people just pontificated endlessly and nobody was facilitating to keep everybody from going down the rabbit holes, for example. So I think that the resistance, in the umbrella of the resistance, is ignorance, and the pieces inside of it are past experiences of it being done badly, and also two legitimate claims, if you will, about the challenges of consensus that people have to make friends with is you lose control. You don't get to very tightly control what the conversation's going to be about or what the options are. When you're voting, the matter to be voted on comes to the group as a proposal. Let's do this, yes or no. And it's a binary decision, because that's very controlled experience, as opposed to, well, we need to figure out what to do about security for the building, and then that's a totally open-ended conversation. And people have to be ready and willing, if not comfortable, to let go of what the answer is going to be and seek what comes to them. So there's a lack of, you have to cede control of the experience to really engage in it. And you also have to be willing to give it a lot of time. People, especially in modern America, people are like, come on, let's do this, let's get this done, let's move right on, we got a lot to do. And when you're shoving everybody through time like that, you don't have the time to discover the answers, the actual answers, what God's will is.
That's really great. I just two things I just wanted to kind of think of, just in reflecting, bouncing back. Like Marcia, like what you were saying is interesting, is that we always think, I think that's the first excuse I would think of avoiding consensus, is that there's always going to be a contrarian. That's why it doesn't work, but I think what you said was interesting, is that if you're doing consensus, right, like why we don't ask the questions like, why are they a contrarian, right? A lot of it is because they're not heard, right? And they're just leveraging the only power that they think they have, is just like stopping the machine, right? And like, what if we reframed it as like, I know you think, but people aren't just contrarian just because they're contrarian. There's always a story behind it. And a lot of it is because a lot of how we do leadership is we don't listen. We don't have empathy. We don't have space for voices, right? And so if you begin to address the greater issue, then it's like the contrarians begin to go away. And we've seen that in Evergreen, because we haven't had like continual like contrarians like people would think. So, I mean, I think there's something really to that, is learning that decision making, it's so much more than just the mechanism, right? I think that's what we critique. And that's what I love about what you're saying, Nora, too, is that the bigger thing is not about like, does this system work? I think that's how everyone just has an ignorant, superficial critique of it, you know, like, that'll never work. Like, it's not practical. Yeah, like that didn't work when we were trying to choose pizza or blah, 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 you know, something silly. But the bigger question is like, do we have a culture of trust, right? I think that sounds like what you were just telling me, is like, the only way you can cede power and voice to other people is like, do you trust the other folks in the room? And I think that's a statement of decision making right now in this country, is that the trust of the other people in the room that are supposed to be like discerning with us, we don't do that because we see them as enemies to our power causes, you know? And so is it any wonder that consensus literally looks crazy to us, you know, because we just don't understand how to cede power, like you're saying, and to trust others.
Well, I think what we say several times in the book, and is so important, is that too often for us here in America, the question is more important than the people making the decision.
Yeah.
Right? Or at least to some people. The question and their side of the question is more important than the people in the room. And that's where, you know, for those that are a little bit afraid of that word trust, right? So maybe I don't necessarily trust everybody in the room, but do I care about them enough as a human being that it's important to listen to them? Because, you know, they carry that part of God that maybe I'm not hearing at the moment. So maybe I don't trust them, but I do believe that everybody's the child of God. And so I need to listen to them to say that I've listened to God. And I say it more simply that the people in the room have got to be more important than the question, because that allows me then to listen to everybody in the room. Again, trust may still be a bit of an issue, but if I value the humanness or the divineness,
Mm-hmm.
and we won't go into those pieces of theology at this point, in each person, then you need to have that in order to do consensus. It doesn't work to say it's my way or the highway, because the highway is where you'll go. Yeah.
Pastor Brown, Sean Brown from Wedgwood, who was at our book launch, he talked about how changing the way that community does their business to consensus actually built trust. That at the beginning, when they first started doing it, there was a lot of mistrust of the process and each other. But over the years of practicing it and learning to do it well, the community, the members of his congregation now trust each other in a way that they didn't before. So it's a little bit of that, you know, which comes first. Okay, if you feel like you don't have enough trust in your community to do consensus, but by doing consensus, you will build that trust. So I guess that means there's an element of faith required.
Yeah, and that's actually something I want to just kind of key into. Actually, Marcia, you were saying, like, I know, you know, we could talk about so many things. Like, this is going into so many wonderful areas. But it is interesting that note you said, like, about believing in that divine worth, you know, though, believing that we are all deserving of the respect entitled to us and honor because we were made in the image of God. It almost feels like this is actually the piece why we can't just say like worldly consensus can work. It almost needs like some kind of theological, like spiritual understanding for this to work, to really believe, like, though the people who are coming into this room, I actually disagree with them very strongly, but because of the inherent worth I see in them, I respect and I listen. I'm not here to conquer them, you know? And I wonder if that's the problem, is like we're trying to find these almost like secularized, like despiritualized spaces of decision making. And it's like they don't work, because if you take out this like sacred worth of people, right? How can we actually find the common ground to like really listen and respect? And you know, there's so much more. There's a whole theology behind this, right? We could just go on a whole seminary course and beyond, but I wonder, like, I think that's very profound what you're just kind of keying in on there. I think that's really great. Sorry, Nora, did you want to add something or say something in addition?
I just was commenting that a theology class based on this would be a great idea.
Well, okay. Well, I know two people who'd be extremely qualified to do this. So, and they actually just have a book that came out called Sacred Decisions. No. So Nora, actually, I just want to ask you personally a question. So another reservation that I hear about the consensus model is the word compromise, which is an ugly word in American culture, I find, and I found very quickly. And but I don't want to cartoon this, because I want to talk about like a real issue. So like, for instance, if I'm in the room with people, and there are people in that room who literally have stood behind issues that have actually been traumatic to me, like as someone of a minority, for instance, you know, to be in that same room and to say that we're all going to be in consensus in this place where there have been these histories of these people representing certain things that are actually harmful or really damaging to me, you know, to think that we're all going to walk out of here with a consensus feels like a genuine compromise or a loss, right? I mean, or even maybe something harmful to me. I think there's a real fear of like, so I guess I just want to really honor that fear, because I think that's a legitimate fear. I think it's understandable. I didn't take it really seriously until I had some very, very real case moments where I had to kind of confront this. What would you say, Nora, to someone who feels like, hey, how can you help me to understand that a compromise will not be a threat to who I am or a danger to me?
It's a really good question. And it goes back to two things we've already talked about. One is trusting not necessarily the other individuals in the room, but trusting the process and trusting the leadership, the facilitator, what we would call a clerk in a Quaker meeting, what you Baptists, I think, would call a moderator, or I don't know who else, a committee chair. I don't know all your nomenclature, but the people in the leadership positions, trusting them, which as a sidebar, I want to mention that it's critically important for consensus to work, that you have leaders who know how to do it well and are committed to it and believe in it completely, and don't even subconsciously undermine the process. So the answer to your question, how can I address your worry that compromise is going to damage you or hurt you? One, I would encourage you to trust the process and trust your leaders. And two, I would remind you that what we're trying to do is not is about seeking God's will. And so on a very fundamental level, I would ask you to trust God, that God is not going to lead your community to do something that will hurt you. So it's not really about compromise in the secular sense of I give up 20% of what I want and you give up 15% of what you want and he gives up the other whatever. It's not like taking a pie and slicing it up and who gets which part of it. That's a construct that's based on the binary idea of winners and losers. How much do I win? How much do I have to lose? The goal is to just set all of that aside and start with a whole different paradigm, which is that we're all in this together. We're in God's hands. We can trust that God is going to lead us to where we need to be.
Yeah, that's really great, because I think when sometimes people hear consensus, they almost feel like it's sort of like a anarchistic reaction to Robert's rules, you know, like, okay, we're not going to go through but like consensus, I think I'm really glad you said that. Like it has its own set of structure and order and flexibility. It's just a different paradigm of it. And what I also love what you're saying is that it's not that we actually all have to come to the table if this is going to work. We all actually 100% submit ourselves to the leading of the Holy Spirit, right? And that's
Exactly.
the kind of the ground rule. And if anyone is not committed to that complete submission to the leading of the Spirit, that's where the power plays and the fears and the mistrust come in, right?
Right, exactly right.
You've got to find that centralizing principle, right? Which comes in like leadership that's committed to it, and that creates the culture and preserves that culture of submission to the Spirit, which I think is really wonderful. And then I think it just echoes again why it's so clear. The titling of your book, it's called Sacred Decisions, consensus in faith communities. This is not just something like you can just throw out to any like Fortune 500 or whatever. It's like, this only really will work. Like it's almost dangerous, I think, if you try and adopt this in a non-spiritual sense, because this is a deeply spiritual act and has a deep spiritual foundation. And what often happens is sometimes companies see something that looks cool and they'll just rip it out of its context. But, like you're saying, like there's more than, 160 years of this and beyond, I'd argue, right? Of the fact that this is a sacred thing. This is a gift. And I think it's a unique gift that we can offer the world, to say that the hope going forward is that what we all need is actually just spiritually informed community that discerns. I think the whole world would be blessed by it.
I agree. The whole world is blessed to the extent that we can function in society through our faith and relying on our faith, and that not my faith versus your faith, but faithfulness. And there are some, and you get better at it. One of the reasons Quakers do this well is we have been practicing it and passing on what we've learned from generation to generation for hundreds of years, and it really helps. We have a kind of catchphrase among Quakers where we will often actually, if I'm walking into a meeting for business that I know is going to have a contentious issue, I will mention to some people, remember, we're supposed to walk into this room expecting to have our minds changed.
That's wonderful. And this is one thing that I really love from the tradition of Judaism, like their understanding, like the rabbinic tradition, is that it's just like, it's not like there's one teacher, like there's one rabbi that everyone, it's like this one rabbi is speaking in like this concert of generations, of centuries, and it's always just like continuing to inform going forward what's going on. I think maybe the intellectualism of the Protestant movement, Christianity, Western Christianity, it's been about like which theology, which speaker, which point of view, we just keep boxing, but we're not really good at seeing like this is a concert of tradition, like evolving and moving forward, which kind of leads to the last thing I really want to address. This is like a great segue. Because in my understanding, my belief is that everything is evolving, everything is developing, right? And consensus has definitely developed and gotten better because, like just what you said, is that people have been doing it for a long time. This is always a hard thing to do because everyone's trying to do it. But like, if you could see, like, what do you feel like is the future of consensus? Like, where do you feel like are the challenges? Because there's no model that's perfect, right? Every model needs to be developed and to grow. What do you think are the questions and challenges for consensus going forward in this day and age?
Well, one of the biggest issues, I think, with consensus that Nora alluded to is that leadership knows what it's doing. Whether you call the leadership a clerk, a facilitator, or whatever. And I'm not sure it can all necessarily happen in some kind of training event, even though we try to put out in the book lots of hints and processes and things that a that a good facilitator should keep in mind. I think one of the biggest challenges is finding the person who can do that. And so if I was leading a meeting and of some sort, some church group, but I was feeling particularly passionate about whatever it was that we were deciding, I can't lead that meeting. I need to find somebody who's neutral. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges when it comes to consensus, is for us not to feel like the leadership has to be one of us, especially if all of us feel passionately about whatever decision we're making. We need to find the person that can lead us, so that we can find a solution that will work for all of us. So that issue of just leadership around consensus, I think, is where there's got the most potential for more work and for change, to embrace the outside leader so that we will do our work better together. That's at least one thing that comes to me.
That's a great point, because you know what you're identifying, because like what you're talking about, leadership in the context of consensus, it sounds like there's a very strong emphasis on intuition, right? Sensitivity, awareness, right? And these are very abstract things that are not easily imparted through training and information, right? And
Exactly.
it's almost like a personality that you're looking for, like a personhood, an identity. And that's really tricky, right? And how do you do that? I think it can be developed, or you can become more sensitive, but it's a much harder thing. It's not just like a lack of information or a lack of tools or something. So yeah, I could definitely see that. Nora, what do you feel like are some of the challenges?
I'd like to build on what Marcia said. I think that there's a couple of challenges, but certainly leadership is front and center in the leading edge, if you will, of spreading the gospel of consensus today, if I'm allowed to use that image. And I think part of the issue with it is that leaders tend to have big egos. They got to be leaders by wanting to be at the top. And some leaders are really good at servant leadership, but especially in American social culture, there is a tendency for the people who have power to feel attached to their power and kind of full of themselves, if you will. And to be a really good facilitator and to have a really effective faith-based consensus process, the facilitator, the leader, has to get their ego out of the process pretty much totally. And so there's kind of this, it's a conflict, as you say. You're looking for somebody with personality traits that lead themselves to servant leadership. And yet we have to look within the pool of leaders who tend to be people who are not servant leaders, but leaders. So I think that's one issue. The other big challenge is that, especially as Marcia and I have constructed the process, it really is, as you say, Sam, totally based on the Spirit and not transferable to a secular situation. Now, there is secular consensus. I mean, NATO operates by consensus. The EU operates by consensus. A couple of Canadian provinces run their governments by consensus.
Yeah.
So it can be done without bringing God into the picture, but it's a different process. And so I think that the future of consensus has an easier, rosier prospect in the faith community, because we all start out in agreement that we want to come closer to God. Presumably, that's why you're a member of a faith community. And so that gives us a common basis for striving to make this work. Long term, I think the biggest challenge for the popularity of consensus is how to move it into the secular world. I don't know how to do it, but that's what I see on the horizon is
Yeah.
how do we translate this and find a way to replace a common belief in God.
I do feel though that the church should be countercultural, and so this is one way the church can be countercultural, is to do their work by consensus. And then if there's enough people doing it that way within faith communities, it's got a better chance of making it in the wider world. Because you would have all these folks who practiced it well. And we say in the book, don't wait to use consensus when you've got a contentious problem. Use it every day so that when the contentious comes up, you'll know how to do it.
Right.
And I think the same thing goes with moving it into the wider world. If we have communities of people that know how to do it, there's a better chance then that we can move it into the secular world.
Yeah, and that makes me think of, Nora, your comment earlier about, one of the greatest obstacles is this ignorance about it, right? And the ignorance is because we just haven't seen it. We just don't know what healthy consensus looks like, right? And I think if more people could see examples of healthy consensus, they would definitely change. Like, I think if just anyone, whether they're Christian or not, came into an Evergreen meeting, they'd be really amazed. There was one pastor who just transferred from a different region into Evergreen a couple of years ago. And I just kind of followed up with him after his first annual meeting with us. And he was just kind of like, he looked a little bewildered. And he's like, this was very different. And he was like, the major topic was just like a very minor budget line item. And it wasn't, and he was just thinking, like, in my previous context, that one line item, like, to bring up that way, it would have been handled completely differently. So he almost looked like he walked into a different universe or something, just how easily it was dealt with. And I wonder if we could just have those more moments where people could kind of just like get out of their universe. And I think one more thing that, Nora, you were saying, and this is also what Marcia was saying, like that, Marcia, I really appreciate that example of, like, can you imagine talking to someone is like, hey, I think the best thing for this is that I step out of the way. I'm going to give the moderation to someone else. And it's hard because, like, our culture of this leadership is that you go to the front, right? You lead front. And then, but the qualification of leadership in a consensus model is much more biblical in that it's about submission, right? The servant is the first. And that is the model that we follow. And it's really hard because, just like everything else in the kingdom of God, it turns everything upside down. And, we just don't like being upside down, right? It's just the way we are. But that's what the kingdom of God does. And I guess this is kind of like just to wrap up our time, why I really wanted to do this podcast. And I had mentioned this at your book opening, is that I had come out of a more conservative, traditional, mainstream denomination. And it was just getting to the point where I was feeling like it was becoming very top heavy authoritarian, and voices were getting left out the more that they pushed one particular voice. And I just felt like, I don't think I can, in good conscience, be a part of this kind of culture anymore. And so I began to search, and I had found my church, Japanese Baptist, but then I also discovered what kind of region it was a part of. And I had a hard time getting around people describing to me what Evergreen was. And once I began to understand it, finally, I was like, this is the right place to be. This is exactly what I've been looking for all this time. And so my hope, my prayer, is that your book, the contents of your book, would go forth and bear much fruit. And it's not just about your book, but it's about, this is totally what the country needs right now. I think this is the prophetic voice we need to hear to really go against this culture that, I would say, even just the past couple of years, like the tribalism, just the animosity, just the contrarian culture, just everything about it, just the violence that all creates. Something like this sacred intuition, this submission, right? Consensus in faith communities. I think this is really the way forward. So I can't give any stronger endorsement about this. I just hope anyone who's listening to this, who's in leadership, you'd really consider this, read the book, really thoughtfully and prayerfully consider this. And thank you so much for your time. I am so thankful for all of you. And hopefully we can have more chats. I think there's a lot of rabbit holes I would definitely be interested in chasing. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for hosting this and inviting us into this time. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And I'm always happy to talk about our work.
Me too. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.